Yes, so thank you. It's lovely to be back at CALRG, and as Freshly mentioned, since my last virtual visit to IET, I've moved from the Faculty of Education at Cambridge, and I'm now working at Lancaster University as a lecturer on the doctoral programme in technology enhanced learning in the Department of Educational Research there. So today I'm going to be talking about a project which has recently concluded, which was funded by the Society for Research in Higher Education under their annual research projects call. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank Sally Po-Tsai, who worked with me as a postdoctoral researcher on the project. And it was called Sort by Relevance: Exploring User Assumptions about Ranking in Online Academic Literature Searches. And it fits in with my research interests around digital scholarship and how the internet is changing academic work. So I'll be talking about that project and also some of the sort of emerging work in progress things that are coming out of it too, since it's concluded. So the project focused on online services and databases, such as Google Scholar, which allow users to search for academic publications and other forms of scholarly literature. So on the one hand, the internet has made it's never been easier for people to be able to engage with and access research literature. And the amount of academic publications that are openly available online is increasing on a daily basis. But as we've seen in other sectors across the use of the internet, the sheer volume of information that's involved in this brings real challenges in relation to effectively searching and locating the right resources. So that's why in various different contexts, we've seen a need to consider how to rank search results. And this is a long-standing problem for information retrieval. But there are also particular reasons why ranking by things such as relevance might be a thornier issue in the context of academic literature searches. So for example, biases that are already present in the scholarly publishing system could be compounded by ranking algorithms, depending on the data that's being used. And there are also methodological risks. For example, when undertaking systematic literature reviews, it's really crucial to be able to understand exactly why particular studies have been included or excluded from the analysis. And the idea of relevance adds a sort of opaque layer to this process. And these are issues that were the focus of an article in the Times Higher in 2021, which I contributed to along with others in the field. And the general take-home message from that was that there was a lot of acknowledgement of these potential risks, but that there's very little research into this specifically. So this project was undertaken to help to fill that gap. So the really classic example of this is Google Scholar, and this Google Scholar is incredibly widely used. It's I think it's fairly safe to say that it's sort of the most popular platform for academic literature searching, and it presents its search results by relevance as the default way of presenting information. Note that this ranking is not the same as the PageRank algorithm, which Google, as a more general search engine, uses. So Google Scholar find results by relevance as default, and it also makes it very hard to customize. The options for sort of filtering are and ranking in different ways are very limited compared to other databases. And the definition from Google Scholar about how its ranking works is shown here in this box. This is the only information that they provide. So as you can see here, it's very short. It introduces a number of factors, but it doesn't provide any information about how those factors are weighted specifically. And the factors that it points to do immediately raise some concerns about fairness. So academic publishing is notoriously hierarchical. So the element of where it was published might exacerbate this. And similarly, who it was written by may prioritise sort of more senior scholars, and how often it's been cited could amplify sort of already known biases in citation practices, which often disadvantage women and scholars of colour. So by combining these factors, there's a real risk of these biases within academic publishing being compounded. And a small number of studies have already been carried out in relation to Google Scholar, but most of them were done quite a while ago. So there were a series of studies by Beale et al., which were the first to address this and to try to test how this works in practice. And those studies largely sort of confirmed the factors involved in the definition shown above. And more recently, a couple of studies by a team led by Rivera et al. Have identified citation counts as being the most influential factor in relation to ranking, and the ranking favours articles written in English. But to what extent is this a particular issue for Google Scholar, or is ranking by relevance more widespread? So this was the first question that we wanted to address through the project. And we found through a systematic survey of 28 of the largest platforms that their ranking by relevance is a lot more prevalent, and it's not restricted to Google Scholar anymore. So out of the 28 platforms that we looked at, all but 2 provided ranking by relevance. And for 22 of them, this was the default way in which search results are presented. But much less consistent was the availability of information about how relevance is being defined by different platforms. Only 13, so just under half of the platforms that we looked at, provided definitions. These were usually located in the help centre or under the frequently asked questions, while the others, despite all of our efforts to locate definitions, they didn't seem to provide any information at all. And in the instances where definitions were provided, they ranged in length and detail from being sort of one sentence up to a full article about how relevance was being calculated, but that was a rare instance. And for the platforms which did provide a definition of relevance, here's this table shows a mapping of the main types of information which featured in those definitions. I must also say apologies here for the poor formatting of the table. The columns did not want to budge. So, but what we can see here is that broadly the sample can be viewed as comprising 2 subgroups. One of the platforms which use models that are based just on aspects of the text. So these are factors that are shown in green here. These are just factors that that relate to the text itself. And there are some, such as dimensions, Science Direct, Scopus, Web of Science, which just fall within this green area. But there's also a second subgroup which combine features of the text with other forms of data, such as the publication, who the author is, citations, and date, for example, shown in pink. So Semantic Scholar, and EBSCOhost, and Google Scholar, for example, draw on both green and pink factors here. And the definitions that are based on aspects of the text might draw upon various different features of the text and be quite sophisticated, such as the number of times that the search term appears, where it appears within the document, and some quite elaborate calculations of how prominent the search term is relative to other parts of the text, and also more advanced text searching, such as multilingual mapping. But the second group often combines this with other forms of data that sort of go beyond the text itself, and it's this sort of area which carries the real risk of compounding those biases in academic publishing. So while a lack of transparency about how ranking algorithms work sort of limited the extent to which we could go into much more detail about the sort of the technical end of how ranking algorithms work, the issue can also be approached from the perspective of the users of the platforms. And this was the main focus really of the project, to explore the assumptions that academics hold about how relevance ranking works, and to discuss what they do in practice as a result. So to address this part of the project, we used an explanatory mixed methods research design, first carrying out an online survey and then following up in more detail with a smaller number of participants through interviews. So the online survey included sections about academics' backgrounds and levels of use of different online platforms, and participants were asked to nominate up to 3 platforms that they use most regularly for literature searches, and to briefly explain through free text responses how they think ranking works on those platforms. And unsurprisingly, the most frequent example that was used here was Google Scholar, which garnered 67 responses, and other popular platforms included PubMed, Scopus, and Web of Science, which ranged between 11 and 17 responses. There was actually quite a surprising range of platforms that were nominated by the participants, but there were a large proportion of very low use platforms, including very sort of niche or institution specific ones as well, which we weren't able to look at because the response rates were just too low for those. So to discuss the platforms in more detail, we held 12 interviews with participants sampled from within the survey responses, and these were carried out online, and participants were asked to carry out live searches on 3 platforms that they often use, using screen sharing and talking through their perceptions of the search ranking with the interviewer. So focusing first on the text responses, where participants had chosen Google Scholar because the data that we had to work with here was much larger compared to the other platforms. The text responses about how they think that search ranking works were categorized first using open coding and then grouped into broader themes. So a sense of saturation was reached quite quickly with the data, and similar factors were coming up time and again. The colour coding here indicates the four sort of broader themes that those categories were grouped into. Grey shows the categories where essentially respondents didn't know how it was ranked. Pink relates to the most frequent factors, which were citations and or keywords, often together. Green relates to the use of personal information, and blue additional information about the publication. The last two factors, themes rather, were often mentioned in connection with citations and keywords too, but they sort of did form distinctly different subgroups. So the first theme, where it was not defined, was the most frequent theme, and although this is, very simply instances where the participants reported not knowing how the ranking functions, there were two slightly different reasons within this. So either that the participants simply stated that they didn't know, or that they acknowledged that it is ranked by an algorithm, but that in itself is not known. It's a black box, or algorithm magic, as one of the participants put it. The quotes at the top here are some from the survey, and then I'm supplementing them with more detail from the interviews in the boxes as we go along. And when conducting and discussing the live Google searches, Google Scholar searches, 3 of the 12 interview participants raised these issues. And the lack of transparency about how the ranking works was also closely related to caution about the reliability of the searches as a result. And not relying solely on Google Scholar was frequently raised as a sort of a practical implication of this. So the second theme reflects that there were two factors which really dominated the beliefs around ranking by relevance here. So search term matching and the number of citations, or often a combination of the two. There was a lot of overlap. It was also the most frequent theme that was raised by the interview participants. There's a bit of variation about the type of text that this is perceived to apply to, and the importance of citations aligns strongly with some of the other studies that have been undertaken on this. And here we've got some of the interview data. And participants discussed the practical implications of the influence of citation counts, which was very interesting to see in practice. So there was acknowledgement that as citations accrue over time, that newly published articles will initially be at a disadvantage. And a tension emerged as a result of this, in that highly ranked search results are likely to be too broad or to reflect established viewpoints, while the participants that we interviewed were often more interested in seeking new and cutting-edge perspectives on their specialist research topics. And as a result, the highly ranked results were generally regarded as a good introduction to a topic, but that they would really be inadequate for most literature reviews. And interestingly, this was also introduced as a potential challenge when doing interdisciplinary work, because average citation counts can vary by subject area. The third and fourth themes occurred much less frequently than the first two, and were often mentioned in conjunction with those core factors of citation counts and keywords. The theme of personal information was only mentioned in about 10% of the survey responses, and by one of the interviewees. And this is interesting because it's something which is not explicitly included in the definition provided by Google, but there's a small but distinct perception to some extent that it might be playing a role. And examples of personal information included personal previous search history, the location of the user, and whether or not they're signed in to Google Scholar at the time. And this theme was only mentioned in one of the interviews. And in that instance, the participant suspected that personalisation based on previous search history was playing a role, but that it was less influential than keyword matching. And the final theme, publication information, was also frequently raised in conjunction with search terms and citations. And this includes metadata, such as the date published, the type of publication. We've got contrasting examples here from the survey about beliefs around Google Books. It was quite interesting to see that particular journals or their metrics, such as impact factors, didn't come up. That's something that I was slightly surprised by. And the combination of factors within this theme, moving beyond keywords and citations to including additional information about a publication, was raised by two of the interview participants. And as participant I notes here, time is also a factor in relation to citations. But if we think back to the definition that Google Scholar itself provides, this theme is the one that is actually most closely aligned with the information that they put out there about the algorithm itself, in that in addition to keywords, it uses, I quote, where it was published, who it was written by, as well as how often and how recently it's been cited in the other scholarly literature. So those were the four main themes that were identified in relation to Google Scholar. But we also wanted to see what we could find out about how this compares to the other platforms that were featured in the survey. So we focused on the responses in relation to Web of Science, Scopus and PubMed, because they were the only other ones which had received more than 10 responses. And there are a few notable contrasts here compared to Google Scholar. So while quite a few respondents indicated that they didn't know how the ranking works, algorithms didn't, this theme of algorithm magic didn't come up at all. And personal information was also absent, and the role of citations was a lot less pronounced. There's also an additional category at the bottom where participants indicated that it didn't really matter to them how ranking by relevance worked, because they would just go ahead and select a different ranking, such as by date, which didn't come up with Google Scholar because the options for customizing are really much more limited. So finally, we also wanted to see if we could find any evidence to suggest whether filter bubbles might be being formed as a result of these rankings. So a filter bubble is present when different users get different results or a different view of a field for some reason. And we tried to look at this through the interviews. In part of the protocol, we asked all of the participants to run the same search in Google Scholar, and then we logged the first page of results. And this, in this colourful matrix here, each column represents a participant, and we've got the date that their interview was carried out, arranged in chronological order. And each cell represents a particular result from Google Scholar. So each the colour represents the same paper across time. So this was a bit of an experimental approach. There's not really an established way of looking at this, and I think we can conclude that it worked to an extent, but that the findings here are quite inconclusive. So I think from the data that we've got here, it more strongly suggests that there might be a trend over time. So there's a temporal element, which makes sense because presumably the data that the algorithm is drawing upon is being updated over time, and that this would reflect those changes. And there are a couple which stand out, such as the one on 6th of October, which is very different to the others, but we weren't really able to pinpoint why, unfortunately. This is something that, yeah, if you could sort of repeat it with a much larger sample, then it might be more successful. So to wrap up the findings from that part of the project, we found that ranking by relevance is now pretty much standard practice in relation to academic literature search platforms. So it's not just an issue for Google Scholar anymore. But definitions are not always provided, and how relevance is defined varies. So even if someone is very accustomed to using ranking by relevance on one platform, it might be completely different on another. And in instances where ranking by relevance combines publication metrics, there is a risk of bias there. And focusing on Google Scholar, we found that there are a range of different factors featuring in academics' perceptions of how ranking works, but really the most prevalent theme was simply acknowledging that it's unknown. And given how prevalent Google Scholar use is, there's a real practical need for raising awareness around these issues. And at the moment, we've got 2 journal papers that are currently undergoing peer review, but the project report is available already via the SRHE website, and along with a couple of short papers that we presented at conferences. And in order to promote sort of openness and replicability, we've also published the survey questions and the interview protocol via Zenodo. So while that project has sort of formally concluded now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that that I'm currently working to build on some of these issues and take this work forwards. But these are all still very much work in progress at the moment. So one of the follow-up activities has been undertaking a systematic scoping review of how the term algorithmic decision making is being used in relation to higher education within the research literature, because it's to try and find those other sort of less prominent ways in which algorithms are being integrated into higher ed. And I'm currently still working on this, but some of the key findings so far are that it's actually not used that much. I was quite surprised, even though it is relevant and related to a number of sort of subfields within higher education, such as learning analytics, the identification of students in need of particular support. It's also features in relation to university admissions, teaching of data literacies and skills to students, and issues of fairness. And the role of algorithms in student recruitment is something which came up in the scoping review, but there's a distinct lack so far in relation to staff recruitment and job applications. And this is also an issue that's becoming more prominent in other contexts more generally. For example, Hilke Schellmann's recent book on how AI can hijack your career and steal your future, which has sort of influenced my thinking here a bit so far too. So I'm currently starting to explore this area and collecting and analysing data about the range of platforms which the university sector uses for job applications. But I think that really, the nature of the use of algorithms, which means that they're rarely transparent, really emphasises the need for questions around algorithmic awareness and algorithmic literacies as an area for research and also for development and support for staff and students. And I think that the need for this is really just going to be supercharged by the ongoing hype around generative AI. But there's also a more an underlying question of how different types of AI, different types of algorithms are defined. They're very vague terms, really, and there's a lot of ambiguity. So to what extent is there an underlying, more generalizable sense of algorithmic literacy or AI literacy? But that's where my thinking is going next. So hopefully watch this space.